The door closed with a sound so soft it almost felt polite. A gentle click. That was all. No slam, no warning, no raised voice. Just a quiet sound that echoed louder in Aloan Vale's chest than any scream ever could. She stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the door as if it might open again on its own. The lock had turned smoothly, deliberately, like someone sealing an envelope they never intended to reopen. On the wall across from her, a clock ticked. 10:47 p.m. Her billionaire husband had just locked her inside. He had called it love. Have you ever trusted someone so completely that you ignored the small unease whispering in your chest? Have you ever told yourself, he wouldn't hurt me, he loves me, only to realize too late that love can sometimes wear the face of control? Because tonight, Aloan was about to learn a lesson that would shatter everything she believed about marriage, power, and the man she had given her heart to. But before we continue, welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you're new here, this channel shares deeply emotional love stories filled with powerful life lessons. Stories about trust, betrayal, healing, and becoming stronger than the pain meant to break you. If stories like this move you, inspire you, or make you reflect on your own life, take a moment to subscribe, like, and share this story. It helps this channel grow and allows more people to find stories that matter. Now, let's go back to the room. The space around Aloan was beautiful. That was the cruelest part. Soft golden lamps glowed against cream-colored walls. The bed was wide and inviting, layered with silk pillows and a blanket that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Fresh flowers sat on the table near the window, their fragrance light and calming. Books she loved, carefully chosen, were arranged neatly on a shelf. Everything about the room whispered comfort. Everything except the door. Aloan walked toward it slowly, as if the closer she got, the more likely it was to open. She placed her palm flat against the wood. It was solid, unmoving. "Real, Cassian?" she called, her voice steady, despite the sudden tightness in her throat. No answer. Moments earlier, he had been standing right there, calm, composed, the same man who kissed her forehead every morning, the same man who once promised that nothing would ever make him cage her spirit. "For your safety," he had said gently, eyes avoiding hers, "I need you to stay here for a while." While the words echoed now, with a meaning she hadn't understood then. Aloan knocked softly at first, then harder. She tried the handle again, though she already knew the result. Her reflection stared back at her from the polished surface. Wide eyes, shallow breaths. A woman struggling to understand how love had turned into confinement without warning. She leaned her forehead against the door. "This isn't funny," she said quietly. "Cassian, please." Footsteps approached on the other side. Relief rushed through her chest. Then his voice came through the door, calm, measured, painfully familiar. "Please trust me," he said. "This is temporary." Temporary. It was the same word he had used when he asked her to pause her work projects. The same word he used when he discouraged her from traveling alone. the same word he used when he made decisions for her, instead of with her. Elowen slid down to the floor as his footsteps faded away. That was when fear finally arrived. Not loud or dramatic, but cold and quiet. She wrapped her arms around herself and tried to make sense of the moment, tried to trace the path that had led her here, tried to remember when protection had begun to feel like permission she never granted. The clock ticked again. 11:02 p.m. Elowen closed her eyes, and memories surfaced uninvited. The first time she met Cassian Holt, he hadn't looked like a billionaire. He had looked like a man who listened. He stood in the doorway of a decaying waterfront estate, sleeves rolled up, dust on his shoes, watching her examine a cracked marble column. When she spoke about the building's history, he didn't interrupt. When she explained what it needed, he didn't dismiss her ideas. He had smiled, just slightly, and said, "You see things people overlook." That was when she felt it, that feeling of being truly seen. Elowen had spent her life restoring old structures, buildings people abandoned, histories people forgot. She believed broken things could be made whole again with patience and care. She never imagined she would one day be locked inside a perfect room, realizing too late that beauty could hide something deeply wrong. The clock crept closer to midnight. 11:31 p.m. Her heartbeat matched its rhythm now. Elowen stood and paced the room, her mind racing through every conversation, every moment she had brushed aside. The subtle changes, the decisions made without her, the way Cassian's concern always arrived, wrapped in logic, never emotion. He's just worried. He knows the world better than I do. He's trying to protect me. Those were the stories she had told herself. Tonight, those stories collapsed. She walked to the window and looked out over the estate grounds. The mansion stood silent, its lights glowing softly against the darkness. Somewhere beyond those walls were hallways she had walked freely just hours ago. Freedom, she realized, was something you rarely noticed until it was gone. 11:47 p.m. Then she heard it. Footsteps, not Cassian's. These were heavier, slower, intentional. A voice followed, deep, firm, carrying authority without effort. "This ends tonight." Lowen's breath caught. She recognized that voice. Larrick Holt, Cassian's father, a man she had met only a handful of times. A man whose presence changed the temperature of any room he entered. A man who believed emotions were weaknesses and truth was a tool. She pressed her ear to the door as voices rose in the hallway. "You don't understand," Cassian said, his tone strained now, defensive. "Oh, I understand perfectly," Alaric replied, "and that's why she deserves to hear it." Keys jingled. Elowen stepped back as the lock turned. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. Whatever was about to be revealed, whatever truth waited on the other side of that door, she knew one thing with painful clarity. Her life would never be the same again. And neither would her understanding of love. The door opened slowly, as if even it hesitated, to reveal what waited on the other side. Eloin's breath caught in her throat. Alaric Holt stood in the doorway first, tall and immaculately dressed, his presence filling the room before he even spoke. His silver hair was neatly combed back, his posture rigid, his eyes sharp with a lifetime of command. He didn't look surprised to see Eloin standing there pale and shaken. If anything, his expression carried something far heavier. Reed. Behind him stood Cassian. Her husband looked nothing like the man who had kissed her forehead that morning. His face was drained of color, his jaw tight, his eyes unable to meet hers. He hovered near the doorframe, hands clenched, as though he were bracing himself for impact. Eloin's heart pounded as she looked from father to son. "What is this?" she asked quietly. No one answered at first. Alaric stepped into the room, his shoes barely making a sound against the floor. He glanced around once, taking in the flowers, the books, the carefully curated comfort. "So this is where you put her," he said, his voice calm but edged with disappointment. "A cage dressed up as kindness." Cassian flinched. Eloin turned to her husband. "Cassian," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it. "Why is your father here?" Cassian swallowed hard. Because things have gone too far." Alaric raised a hand, silencing him. Then he turned his attention fully to Eloin. "You deserve the truth," he said, "and you should have heard it long before tonight." Eloin felt the weight of those words settle into her chest. Truth. The word sounded fragile now, like something easily broken. "Your husband didn't lock you in here to protect you," Alaric continued. "He did it because he was afraid of what you already know." Eloin's brows furrowed. "What I know?" Cassian took a step forward. "Eloin, please," he said softly. "Let me explain." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw fear instead of confidence, desperation instead of calm authority. "You've had time," she said. "I've had a locked door." Alaric nodded once. "Let her speak." Silence filled the room again, thick and heavy. Finally, Alaric exhaled slowly and began. "Years ago," he said, "Cassian made a decision. One that kept the Holt Empire clean on paper but dirty beneath the surface. Documents were adjusted, records were moved, properties were transferred quietly. No one was meant to look too closely." Eloin's stomach tightened. Her work? The waterfront estate, the ledgers hidden behind walls, the inconsistencies she had flagged without fully understanding their implications. "You found pieces of it," Alaric said, as if reading her thoughts. "Not because you were searching, but because you're thorough, honest. You see details others ignore." Cassian's voice cracked. "I didn't know at first. When we met, I had no idea she'd ever come close to it." Eloin stared at him. "But you realized it eventually." He nodded, shame flooding his features. "And I thought If I married you, if I built a life with you, none of it would matter anymore. I thought love would bury the past. Her chest ached. So you locked me in a room, she asked, because love wasn't enough? Cassian's shoulders sagged. Because fear was louder. Alaric folded his hands behind his back. Fear turns intelligent men into cowards, he said bluntly. And cowards believe control is strength. Elowen felt something shift inside her. Not rage, not yet, but clarity. All the moments she had brushed aside replayed themselves with brutal sharpness. Cassian insisting on approving her travel. Cassian discouraging her projects. Cassian framing every restriction as concern. This wasn't sudden. This had been building. You didn't trust me, she said quietly. Cassian shook his head. I loved you. That's not the same thing, she replied. The room felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in, despite the open door. Elowen walked past them toward the window, needing air, needing space to breathe. Outside, the estate lay still, untouched by the storm unfolding inside her chest. Do you know what hurts the most? She asked, without turning around. It's not the secret. It's that you decided for me. You took my voice before I even knew I needed it. Cassian stepped closer. I was trying to protect everything we built. Lowen turned, her eyes glistening. Love doesn't need cages to survive. Alaric watched the exchange closely. For the first time, the legendary man looked older, tired, perhaps, of seeing history repeat itself. I raised my son to believe emotions were weaknesses, he said quietly. Tonight, I see the damage of that lesson clearly. Cassian's gaze dropped to the floor. Elowen, Alaric continued, by morning, this will be addressed properly. Lawyers will be involved. Records will be corrected. The truth will no longer be hidden. She nodded slowly. And my marriage? Cassian looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. Elowen held his gaze for a long moment. She remembered the man who once listened, the man she had loved, the man who had chosen fear over trust. I don't know, she said honestly, but I do know this. Love cannot survive where freedom doesn't exist. The clock chimed softly. Midnight. The sound felt final. Elowen walked to the bed and picked up a small bag she hadn't realized she'd packed earlier in panic. Her hands were steady now. Calm had replaced fear, not because the pain was gone, but because truth had arrived. Cassian reached out, stopping just short of touching her. Please, he whispered, let me make this right. She met his eyes one last time. Making things right starts with letting go. She stepped past him and into the hallway. The mansion felt different now, larger, quieter, stripped of illusion. Each step carried weight, but also relief. For the first time that night, Elowen felt her lungs fill fully with air. At the entrance, she paused. Alaric stood behind her. "You're stronger than you know," he said. "Braver than most." She offered a small, sad smile. "I just finally listened to myself." Outside, the night air was cool and sharp. Dawn was still hours away, but Eloan felt something inside her awaken, a fragile but powerful sense of reclaiming herself. As she walked away from the estate, one truth settled deep in her heart. Love should never make you smaller, and silence should never be the price of security. Tonight, she had lost the life she thought she had, but she had found something far more important. Her freedom. If this story made you feel something, fear, love, or heartbreak, please like this video so it reaches others who need to hear it. I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think love can survive when trust is broken? And if you believe love stories should teach real-life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because Chapter 2 reveals how this love began and why the warning signs were so easy to miss. Long before the locked door, before the silence and the fear, Eloan Vale lived a life few people noticed, and even fewer truly understood. She woke early, not because anyone demanded it, but because mornings felt honest. The world was quieter then. Expectations hadn't yet crowded the air. She liked that feeling of starting the day on her own terms. Her apartment was small but warm, filled with light that spilled through tall windows and rested gently on unfinished sketches, rolled blueprints, and notebooks filled with careful handwriting. Eloan didn't collect expensive things. She collected stories of buildings, of places, of forgotten beauty waiting to be restored. She worked as a restoration consultant, a profession that required patience, precision, and respect for history. Her job wasn't to erase the past, but to understand it, to strengthen what remained without destroying what once was. She believed people were a lot like that too. Eloan had learned early that not everything broken needed replacing. Some things simply needed care. She hadn't grown up wealthy. Comfort, yes. Excess, no. Her childhood had been steady, shaped by routines, values, and a quiet emphasis on self-reliance. She was taught to stand on her own feet, to ask questions, and to trust her instincts, even when they whispered instead of shouted. Those instincts had carried her far. By her early 30s, Eloan had built a reputation for being thorough and honest. She didn't rush projects. She didn't flatter clients. She told the truth, even when it complicated things. Especially then, that honesty came at a cost. She turned down lucrative offers that didn't align with her principles. She walked away from partnerships that felt rushed or dishonest. Friends sometimes wondered why she didn't aim higher or chase more visible success. But Eloan wasn't chasing applause. She was chasing meaning. Still, there were nights when she felt the ache of loneliness settle quietly beside her. Not desperation, just a gentle longing. She wanted partnership, not rescue. Connection, not dependence. Someone who would walk beside her, not ahead of her, not behind her. She had seen relationships where one person disappeared into the other. She promised herself she would never be one of them. That promise mattered more than she realized. The call that changed everything came on a rainy afternoon. A private firm representing the Holt family requested an evaluation of an old waterfront estate, one that had been closed to the public for decades. The job was discreet, well paid, and unusually specific. They wanted someone detail-oriented, someone who wouldn't rush. Elowen hesitated. The Holt name was everywhere. Industry journals, financial news, whispered admiration. Powerful families often came with complicated expectations. But the estate intrigued her. Its history, its age, its potential. She accepted. The estate sat near the water, weathered by time, but still proud. Stone walls softened by ivy. Windows that reflected both past and present. As Elowen walked through the property for the first time, she felt a familiar excitement, a sense of responsibility. This place had stories to tell. She worked alone most days, documenting structural details, tracing changes made over decades, studying materials others might overlook. She noticed things, patterns, small inconsistencies that didn't quite add up, though she filed them away without judgment. Her job wasn't investigation. It was preservation. Then, one afternoon, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, expecting an assistant or groundskeeper. Instead, she saw him. Cassian Holt wasn't wearing a cape. He wasn't surrounded by people. He stood there quietly, hands in his pockets, observing her as she measured a cracked column with focused intensity. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said. Elowen straightened. "Not at all. I've been told you're thorough," he added. "That you don't miss details?" She met his gaze. "I believe details are how places tell the truth." Something flickered in his expression. Interest, perhaps. "I'm Cassian," he said simply. She nodded. "Elowen." There was no grand introduction, no performance, just two people standing in a building that had survived decades of change. They spoke for nearly an hour. Not about money, not about timelines, about the building's history, its original design, the philosophy behind preserving what matters rather than replacing it. Cassian listened, truly listened. He asked questions that showed curiosity, not control. When she finished explaining a particularly delicate structural issue, he smiled faintly. "You see things people overlook," he said. The words stayed with her long after he left. Their meetings became more frequent, sometimes professional, sometimes unexpectedly personal. Cassian shared stories of growing up under pressure, of expectations that felt heavier than responsibility. He didn't complain. He reflected. Elowen shared her love for quiet work, for evenings spent reading, for the satisfaction of restoring something with care. Their connection grew not through grand gestures, but through presence. Cassian never rushed her, never pushed. He respected her boundaries. When he invited her to dinner for the first time, he made it clear there was no obligation. When she declined due to work, he accepted it without question. That mattered to her. Slowly, affection bloomed. Gentle, deliberate. Their conversations deepened. Their silences grew comfortable. He remembered small things, how she took her tea, which books she loved, how she preferred quiet walks to crowded events. Eloan felt safe. Looking back, she would later realize how much safety mattered to her, how easily she mistook calm for trust and consistency for freedom. But at the time, it felt right. For the first time in years, she imagined a future that included someone else, not as a sacrifice, but as an addition. She didn't know then that some lessons arrive wrapped in beauty. That power can be quiet. That control often waits patiently, wearing the mask of care. And that sometimes the most important education life offers doesn't come from books or experience, but from the moments we choose not to question. What Eloan didn't realize then was how carefully her life had been balanced before Cassian entered it. Not lonely, just whole. Her days followed a rhythm she trusted. Mornings belonged to work and focus. Afternoons carried the satisfaction of progress. Evenings were quiet, often spent with a book, music playing softly in the background, or long walks where she allowed her thoughts to settle. She had learned to enjoy her own company, and that self-sufficiency gave her a quiet confidence. So when Cassian began to occupy her thoughts, she noticed the change immediately. And instead of fear, she felt curiosity. Their meetings at the estate gradually blurred the line between professional and personal. Cassian never forced that shift. He let it happen naturally, through conversation rather than persuasion. He would ask about her opinions, about buildings, about people, about life, and then sit back and listen as if her words mattered more than his own. That was rare. Eloan had met men who spoke endlessly, men who mistook dominance for depth. Cassian was different. He asked thoughtful questions and allowed silence to exist without discomfort. He seemed most present when he wasn't trying to impress anyone. Sometimes, after a long day of work, they would walk the grounds together. The estate looked different in the evening light, softer somehow. Cassian would tell her about his travels, the countries he had visited, the cities that blurred together because none of them truly felt like home. "I've been everywhere," he once said, hands resting in his pockets as they watched the water ripple gently. "And yet, I still feel like I'm passing through." Eloan understood that feeling more than she expected. Despite his wealth and influence, Cassian spoke often about wanting simplicity, about craving a life where he didn't have to measure every word or decision against expectations. When he talked about the future, he didn't mention numbers or acquisitions. He mentioned peace, made him feel human. As weeks passed, Cassian began inviting her to dinner. Nothing extravagant. Quiet restaurants, home-cooked meals prepared by staff who respected privacy. He always gave her the option to say no, and when she did, he never questioned her choice. That mattered too. Slowly, affection deepened. He remembered how she preferred the lights dimmed in the evening. He noticed when she grew quiet and didn't push her to explain. When she laughed, he watched her like it was something precious. Their first kiss wasn't dramatic. It happened on the estate grounds, under a sky heavy with clouds. They had been talking about old buildings and forgotten stories when the conversation faded into something softer. Cassian paused, giving her time to step away. She didn't. The kiss was gentle, unhurried, filled with warmth rather than urgency. Eloan felt something settle inside her, a sense of ease she hadn't known she was missing. From then on, their relationship grew in layers. They shared quiet mornings and thoughtful evenings. Cassian would leave handwritten notes instead of sending messages. Eloan found herself smiling at unexpected moments, her heart opening without effort. For the first time, she believed love didn't have to be loud to be real. But beneath that calm, subtle shifts were already beginning, too small to alarm her, too gentle to resist. Cassian asked questions about her schedule, not in a demanding way, just curious, he said. He offered suggestions about security when she traveled. He expressed concern about certain projects being too exposed. Eloan noticed, but she trusted him. After all, he lived in a world where risk was real, where attention could be dangerous. She believed his caution came from care, not control. Looking back, she would later understand an important lesson. Control rarely arrives with force. It arrives wrapped in logic. Cassian spoke often of his father, though never with warmth. Alaric Holt loomed in his stories as a presence more than a person, demanding, exacting, emotionally distant. Cassian learned early that approval was conditional, earned only through success. "I don't want to be like him," Cassian once said quietly. "I don't want my life to feel like a transaction." Eloan believed him. She believed the way he looked at her meant safety. She believed his desire for partnership was genuine. She believed love could soften old wounds. What she didn't see was how deeply fear still shaped him. The proposal came unexpectedly. There was no crowd, no cameras, just Cassian and Eloan standing by the water at dusk. He spoke simply, without rehearsed words or dramatic gestures. "I don't want a life built on control," he said. "I want one built on trust, and I want to build it with you." Eloan said yes, without hesitation. In that moment, it felt like choosing love over doubt, hope over caution, connection over solitude. She didn't know then that promises are only as strong as the fears they confront. As their engagement unfolded, Eloan noticed her world expanding in some ways and narrowing in others. She was welcomed into circles she never imagined, yet quietly encouraged to step back from parts of herself she had once protected fiercely. It didn't feel like loss at the time. It felt like compromise. That distinction would matter later. Their love story in those early days was sincere, real, beautiful, even. And that is what made the eventual betrayal so devastating. Because when love begins gently, when it feels safe and thoughtful, we often stop asking the questions that protect us. We assume calm means clarity. We assume stability means freedom. We assume love will always choose trust over fear. Sometimes those assumptions become the lessons that change us forever. Love didn't arrive in Elowen's life like a storm. It arrived like still water, quiet, reflective, almost soothing. By the time she realized how deeply Cassian Holt had entered her world, he wasn't just a presence anymore. He was part of her routine, woven gently into her days in ways that felt natural rather than intrusive. That was what made him dangerous, in a way she couldn't yet name. Cassian never rushed her emotions. He never pushed for declarations or demanded reassurance. Instead, he allowed the relationship to breathe, unfolding at a pace that made Elowen feel respected, and for a woman who valued autonomy above almost everything else, that respect mattered. When they weren't together, Cassian sent short messages, not to check where she was, but to ask how her day had gone. He remembered details others forgot: the project she was nervous about, the meeting she didn't look forward to, the book she mentioned in passing weeks earlier. It felt intentional. Elowen found herself opening up in ways she hadn't planned. She spoke about her childhood, her love for restoring forgotten places, her belief that history deserved honesty rather than erasure. Cassian listened without judgment, his attention unwavering. He spoke too, but selectively. He talked about pressure, about expectations that began long before he understood them, about a childhood spent learning how not to fail rather than how to live. He never painted himself as a victim, but Elowen could hear the restraint in his voice, the careful distance he kept between memory and emotion. She admired his composure. What she didn't recognize yet was how deeply that composure was rooted in fear. Cassian's public life was a world Elowen observed from a careful distance. Headlines praised his leadership. Industry circles admired his precision. To them, Cassian Holt was disciplined, strategic, and almost unreadable. With her, he was different. At least, that's what it felt like. He smiled more easily, laughed quietly, let his guard down in small ways: long walks without security, dinners without formality, evenings where he loosened his tie and spoke about wanting a life that felt less managed. "I don't want everything to be controlled," he once said, as they sat on her small balcony, city lights glowing below. "I want something real." Elowen believed him. She believed that love could exist outside of power, that wealth didn't have to dictate identity, that people could choose who they wanted to be, regardless of how they were raised. Their intimacy deepened slowly. Cassian's affection was tender rather than consuming. He held her as though she were something to be protected, not possessed. Their closeness felt mutual, balanced, unforced. For Elowen, intimacy had always meant safety, the ability to be herself without shrinking. Cassian seemed to offer that. He encouraged her work, praised her dedication, admired her independence. "You don't need me," he once said softly. And that's exactly Why I want you. Those words stayed with her. They felt like freedom. Yet woven into those moments were subtle shifts, small enough to ignore, easy enough to excuse. Cassian asked more questions about her projects, not because he doubted her ability, but because he worried about exposure. He suggested certain sites might attract unwanted attention. He offered to arrange transportation, security, schedules. Elowen hesitated, then agreed. It made sense, she told herself. His world was different. His concerns were informed by experience. Still, there were moments, brief and fleeting, when she felt a quiet resistance rise within her, a sense that something was tightening, though nothing had closed yet. She pushed those thoughts away. Love, she believed, required trust. Cassian's affection grew more visible as time passed. He introduced her to colleagues as his partner, never dismissing her presence or minimizing her work. He asked for her opinion in private, spoke of future plans with her included. Marriage wasn't discussed immediately, and when it finally was, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like progression. They spoke about shared values, about building something meaningful together. Cassian emphasized partnership. Elowen emphasized honesty. They agreed on more than they disagreed on, or so it seemed. What Elowen didn't yet understand was how much Cassian feared losing control, not over her, but over everything. That fear shaped him more than he admitted. It guided his decisions, softened his voice, sharpened his instincts. It made him protective in ways that felt loving on the surface, but rooted in anxiety beneath. And fear, left unchallenged, has a way of changing love into something else entirely. Looking back, Elowen would later realize that the man she fell in love with was real. But he wasn't whole. He was a man divided between who he wanted to be and who he had been trained to become. And love, no matter how sincere, cannot heal what refuses to be faced. At the time, though, Elowen saw only the man who listened, the man who remembered, the man who promised a life built on trust. She didn't yet see the quiet struggle unfolding beneath his calm exterior, or how that struggle would one day cost them everything. As their relationship deepened, Elowen began to see the private rhythms of Cassian's life, the spaces he kept hidden from the public, and sometimes from himself. He invited her into his world carefully, like someone opening doors one at a time, checking each room before allowing her inside. She met colleagues who spoke about him with admiration, bordering on awe. She attended quiet dinners where conversations were measured, polite, and strategic. In those spaces, Cassian became someone else. Not colder, just quieter, more controlled. Elowen noticed how his posture shifted, how his words became precise, how his smiles were calculated rather than spontaneous. It unsettled her at first, but she told herself everyone wore different faces in different rooms. Even she did. Still, there were moments when she caught him watching her closely, as though gauging her reactions. Not judging, assessing. It was subtle, fleeting, and easy to dismiss. Love has a way of softening our awareness. One evening, after a long event filled with conversations she barely remembered, Aloan finally spoke about it. "You disappear sometimes," she said gently, as they sat together afterward, shoes kicked off, the city glowing beyond the window. Not physically, emotionally. Cassian didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was calm. "I've learned to be careful. With me, too?" she asked. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something vulnerable flickered in his eyes, especially with the things that matter. She took his hand, believing that vulnerability meant trust. What she didn't know was that carefulness and secrecy often share the same roots. Cassian began talking more openly about his father, not in stories, but in patterns. How decisions had to be flawless. How mistakes weren't corrected, only buried. How emotional distance had been mistaken for strength. "I learned early that control was survival," he admitted once. "If you lose control, you lose everything." Elowen squeezed his hand. "You don't have to live like that anymore." He smiled faintly. "That's what I'm trying to learn." Their intimacy grew richer with honesty, at least the kind Cassian felt safe sharing. They spent evenings talking quietly, bodies close, voices low, sharing dreams rather than plans. Elowen felt connected in a way she hadn't before, emotionally grounded rather than swept away. She believed she was seeing the real man beneath the armor, and in many ways, she was. But armor isn't removed all at once. It's loosened, slowly, selectively, often leaving the most important pieces still in place. Cassian admired Elowen's independence deeply. He spoke of it often, yet he struggled to live comfortably beside it. When she traveled for work, he worried. When she met new clients, he asked careful questions. When she spoke passionately about projects beyond his influence, his expression tightened briefly before smoothing again. He never, no, he suggested, and suggestions, when repeated gently enough, can reshape choices without ever sounding like commands. Elowen didn't notice how often she adjusted her plans to avoid his concern, how she simplified explanations, how she chose reassurance over assertion, not because he asked her to, but because she loved him. Love, she believed, was compromise. But compromise becomes dangerous when only one person is adjusting. Cassian's proposal came not long after one of their rare disagreements. They had argued, softly, about her accepting a long-term project far from the city. Cassian had raised concerns. She had defended her decision. The conversation ended unresolved, but calm. The next evening, he invited her to the waterfront. There was no spectacle, no audience, just the sound of water and the fading light of day. "I don't want to lose you," he said simply. "I don't want to be the man who limits you." He paused, then added, "I want to build a life where we protect each other. Together." The ring was understated. Elegant, thoughtful, Aloan said yes, not because she felt pressured, but because she believed him. Because she believed love could grow stronger with commitment, not smaller. In that moment, she felt chosen, not owned. The months that followed were filled with planning, introductions, adjustments. Aloan moved through it all with optimism, believing she was stepping into a partnership built on respect. Yet quietly, her world began to orbit more closely around Cassian's. Not by force, by gravity. She still worked, still dreamed, still spoke her mind. But she also checked schedules against his, considered optics, thought about timing, exposure, risk. She told herself it was maturity. She didn't yet realize she was learning to live inside someone else's fear. Cassian, for his part, believed he was protecting what mattered most. He believed that love justified caution, that leadership required foresight, that preventing pain, even preemptively, was an act of devotion. Neither of them noticed how far apart their definitions of love were drifting. Aloan believed love expanded you. Cassian believed love needed containment. And until those beliefs collided, everything still looked like harmony. She fell asleep each night, believing she knew the man beside her. She didn't know yet that love, when shaped by fear, doesn't break loudly. It tightens, slowly, silently, until one day you find yourself standing in a beautiful room, staring at a locked door, wondering when love became something you needed to escape. The night Cassian asked Aloan to marry him, the air felt unusually still, not heavy, just quiet, as if the world itself had paused to listen. They stood near the edge of the water, the same place where so many of their conversations had unfolded naturally, without pressure or performance. The sun was slipping away, painting the horizon in soft shades of gold and blue. It was beautiful, but not extravagant. That, Aloan would later realize, was part of why she said yes so easily. Cassian wasn't trying to impress her. He was trying to reassure himself. "I don't want a life built on control," he said again, his voice steady but careful. "I want a life built on trust." He spoke about partnership, about respect, about choosing each other every day, even when things were difficult. He didn't promise perfection. He promised effort, and to Aloan, effort mattered more than vows. She had seen relationships fail not because love disappeared, but because people stopped trying to understand each other. Cassian, in that moment, seemed deeply committed to understanding. So when he slipped the ring onto her finger, simple and elegant, she felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. This was not a rescue. This was a choice. The engagement brought with it a rush of change, meetings, schedules, expectations, but Aloan approached it with the same grounded mindset she brought to everything else. She wanted the wedding to reflect who they were, not who the world expected them to be. Cassian agreed. At least, at first. Plans were discussed thoughtfully. The guest list grew carefully. The location was chosen with intention. Yet as decisions accumulated, Elowen began to notice how often Cassian deferred, not to her, but to circumstance. This would be better for optics. My father prefers this. It's simpler if we do it this way. None of it felt wrong on its own. It felt practical, and practicality, Elowen believed, was part of adulthood. Still, there were moments when she felt like a guest in her own celebration, when conversations shifted before she could finish a sentence, when decisions were finalized before she realized they were being discussed. She reminded herself that compromise was part of marriage. She reminded herself that love required flexibility. The wedding day arrived, wrapped in elegance. The venue was stunning. The arrangements flawless. Everything unfolded with precision, like a carefully rehearsed performance. To the outside world, it was a union of grace and power. A beautiful woman marrying a respected billionaire. But inside, Elowen felt something quieter. Not doubt. Reflection. As she stood across from Cassian, she saw the man she loved, the one who listened, who remembered, who held her gently when the world felt overwhelming. She also saw a man carrying the weight of expectation so deeply that he barely noticed it anymore. When they exchanged vows, Cassian spoke of protection and commitment, of building a future free from fear. Elowen spoke of honesty and partnership, of walking side by side. Their words didn't conflict, but they weren't identical either. Marriage, she believed, was where two truths learned how to coexist. The early months were warm. Cassian was attentive in ways that felt sincere. He made time for her, despite his demanding schedule. He kissed her forehead every morning, held her close at night, spoke often about how grateful he was to have found her. Their intimacy was gentle, unhurried, rooted in closeness rather than urgency. Elowen felt cherished, wanted, seen. She noticed how Cassian relaxed around her, how his shoulders loosened when he returned home, how his voice softened when he spoke her name. For a while, love felt exactly the way she had imagined it would. Yet beneath that warmth, subtle shifts continued. Cassian began making decisions more confidently about travel, about security, about timing. He framed them as necessities, responsibilities that came with the life they shared now. This is just how things work at this level, he would say calmly. Elowen nodded, trusting his experience. She still worked, still pursued her projects, still believed she was living freely. But she also began to notice how often she adjusted, not because she was asked to, but because it seemed easier. Easier to agree. Easier to adapt. Easier to trust. Marriage, she believed, required sacrifice. What she didn't yet realize was the difference between sacrifice and surrender. Cassian loved Elowen deeply. Of that, there was no question. But love, shaped by fear, doesn't always recognize the damage it causes. And fear, when left unexamined, has a way of disguising itself as responsibility. As Elowen settled into her new life, she felt proud of the woman she had become. Capable, loved, partnered. She believed she had chosen wisely. She didn't yet see the slow narrowing of her world, or how easily vows meant to protect could become rules meant to contain. For now, the promise still felt intact. But promises, like foundations, are tested not by beauty, but by pressure. Marriage did not change Elowen overnight. If anything, it deepened what already existed. She still woke early, still found comfort in quiet mornings, still approached her work with care and discipline. Cassian still left notes for her on the kitchen counter, still checked in during the day, still spoke of building a life that felt intentional rather than inherited. From the outside, their marriage looked steady, balanced even. But inside that balance, weight was being distributed unevenly. The first changes came softly, almost imperceptibly. Cassian suggested adjusting her travel schedule so she wouldn't be away during important meetings. He recommended postponing certain projects until things settled. He expressed concern about unfamiliar contractors and locations, reminding her of the attention that came with his name. None of it felt unreasonable. Elowen told herself this was what partnership looked like. Two people considering each other in every decision. She wanted to be supportive. She wanted to show that marriage hadn't made her rigid. So she compromised. She turned down one project, then another. She postponed travel. She adjusted timelines. And each time, Cassian thanked her with affection, with reassurance, with promises that it was temporary. Temporary. That word returned quietly, like a familiar guest. Their home became a place of comfort and intimacy. Evenings were calm. Conversations were thoughtful. Cassian often spoke about the future, about stability, about legacy, about protecting what they had built together. Elowen listened, believing these conversations were shared visions rather than directives. But there were moments when she felt something missing. She noticed how rarely Cassian asked for her opinion on decisions that affected her directly. How often choices were presented already formed. How we sometimes sounded more like "I've decided." She brushed off the discomfort. After all, Cassian carried responsibilities she didn't. His world was complex. His caution, she believed, was informed by experience. Yet, small moments began to linger in her mind. The time she accepted a consulting job abroad, and Cassian grew uncharacteristically quiet. His concern expressed through silence rather than discussion. The evening she mentioned attending a professional conference, and he questioned the necessity, citing security and timing. The way he framed his objections as care. Never demands, never commands. Elowen found herself reassuring him more often than before. "I'll be careful. It's nothing to worry about. I'll keep you updated." She didn't notice how often she was asking permission without realizing it. Marriage, she had always believed, was about blending lives, not losing them. But blending required awareness, something she was slowly losing as routine replaced reflection. Cassian, meanwhile, believed he was doing the right thing. He saw the world as a place full of risks he had been trained to anticipate. He believed leadership meant prevention, that love meant shielding those you cared about from harm, even if that meant limiting their exposure. He didn't see himself as controlling. He saw himself as responsible. When Eloin questioned him, gently, he responded with calm explanations. He spoke of danger, of scrutiny, of how fragile stability could be. "I just don't want anything to happen to you," he would say. "I couldn't live with myself. If it did," those words were powerful. They carried weight. Eloin didn't want to be the source of his fear. So she softened her objections. She adapted. She told herself this was the natural evolution of love. But love that requires shrinking is not evolution. It's erosion. There were nights when Eloin lay awake beside Cassian, listening to his steady breathing, wondering why she felt restless despite having everything she thought she wanted. She couldn't name the feeling yet, only that something essential felt quieter than before. Her independence, once a source of pride, now felt like something she had to justify. Cassian noticed the distance, but misunderstood its cause. He responded with more attention, more planning, more oversight, believing closeness would fix what was slipping away. Instead, it tightened the space between them. Neither of them intended harm. That was the tragedy. Marriage magnified who they already were. Eloin was someone who gave easily, trusted deeply, and adapted out of love. Cassian was someone shaped by fear, taught to control outcomes, and rewarded for precision. Together, those traits created a dynamic neither fully recognized. And dynamics, once established, rarely announce themselves as dangerous. They settle in quietly. They feel normal until one day you realize your choices no longer feel like your own. As Eloin moved through her days, adjusting and accommodating, she still believed she had made the right choice. She still believed love would balance itself out. She didn't yet understand that the most important vows aren't spoken aloud. They're lived, and when lived without awareness, they can slowly bind instead of protect. The foundation had been laid. The promises spoken. Now the weight of those vows would begin to test them both. Alaric Holt had always been more presence than person. Even when he wasn't in the room, his influence lingered, silent, firm, unmistakable. For Cassian, his father's expectations had shaped every stage of life, long before he understood what those expectations demanded in return. Eloin sensed this before she fully understood it. Her first extended encounter with Alaric came during a formal dinner at the Holt family residence, a sprawling estate where everything was polished, measured, and carefully curated. The table settings were flawless, the conversations precise. Even laughter felt controlled, as though it had been rehearsed. Alaric sat at the head of the table, posture rigid, gaze steady. When he spoke, people listened, not because he raised his voice, but because silence followed naturally. Eloin noticed how Cassian changed in his presence. His shoulders squared, His words shortened. His movements became deliberate, restrained. He wasn't afraid, but he was alert, as though constantly evaluating his own performance. Alaric greeted Eloan politely, his tone formal, his interest measured. He asked about her work, not out of curiosity, but assessment. He listened carefully, eyes narrowing slightly as she spoke. "You restore old things," he said. "Why?" Eloan considered her answer. "Because what lasts deserves care, and because history teaches us who we are." Alaric studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Then he nodded once. "Preservation is efficient," he said, "when done correctly." That was the extent of his approval. Later that evening, Eloan asked Cassian about his father. "He expects excellence," Cassian said simply, "and affection." She asked gently. Cassian hesitated. He believes emotions complicate outcomes. That explained more than he realized. Cassian's childhood had been structured, disciplined, and achievement-driven. Praise was earned, not given. Mistakes were addressed quietly, never discussed openly. Success was expected. Failure was absorbed and corrected without reflection. Love, in that environment, was conditional. Cassian learned early that control meant safety, that emotions were risks, that vulnerability invited consequences. Those lessons didn't disappear with age. They matured. As Cassian rose within the Holt Empire, Alaric remained a constant presence, demanding precision, discouraging exposure, reinforcing the idea that perception mattered more than intention. Never give people access to what they can use against you, Alaric once told him. Cassian carried those words into adulthood. To marriage, Eloan began noticing how often Cassian referenced his father when making decisions. "This how it's done. This what works. My father always said." At first, it seemed like respect. Later, it felt like inheritance. Alaric's influence wasn't limited to business. It shaped how Cassian viewed responsibility, protection, and authority. Cassian believed leadership meant prevention, that it was better to act early, quietly, and decisively than risk uncertainty. When Eloan questioned certain restrictions, Cassian didn't see it as disagreement. He saw it as risk, and risk, in his world, had to be eliminated. Eloan, however, had been raised differently. She believed growth required openness. That trust meant allowing uncertainty, that people learned through experience, not avoidance. Their differences weren't loud. They were philosophical. And philosophy, when unexamined, quietly governs behavior. Alaric watched their marriage from a distance. He didn't interfere openly. He didn't offer advice unless asked. But his presence hovered through expectations, through influence, through the unspoken standard Cassian still measured himself against. Eloan felt it when Cassian grew tense before family gatherings, when he reviewed conversations afterward, analyzing tone and implication, when he avoided vulnerability in spaces where power was on display. She tried to reassure him. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," she told him once. Cassian smiled faintly. "That's where you're wrong." The shadow of Alaric Holt was long, and Cassian, despite his success, still stood within it. Elowen didn't yet understand how deeply that shadow would reach into their marriage, how it would shape decisions that felt personal but were driven by inherited fear. But she felt its weight, and weight, when carried too long, begins to change how people move, how they speak, how they love. Elowen began to understand Alaric Holt not through what he said, but through what Cassian feared. It showed in small moments. First, a pause before answering certain questions, a careful choice of words when discussing family matters, a subtle tension that appeared whenever Cassian felt judged, even when no judgment was spoken aloud. Alaric rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. His authority lived in expectation, not intimidation. He believed leadership was about foresight, not forgiveness. In his world, mistakes weren't lessons. They were liabilities. Cassian had grown up learning that love was something you earned by being useful, successful, and controlled. And while he told himself he wanted something different, those lessons still guided him when fear crept in. Elowen noticed how Cassian's decision-making changed after interactions with his father. He became more rigid, more precise, less open to discussion. It was as though Alaric's presence reminded him of the consequences of uncertainty. One evening, after a particularly formal family dinner, Elowen finally spoke. "You don't breathe around him," she said quietly, once they were alone. Cassian frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You measure everything," she replied. "Your words, your tone, even your silence." Cassian didn't deny it. He sat down heavily, rubbing his hands together. "I can't afford mistakes," he said. "Not in his world." Elowen sat beside him. "But we don't live in his world." Cassian looked at her, something conflicted flickering behind his eyes. "It's not that, thou simple." Right. Alaric's influence extended beyond family dinners. He remained involved in the Empire's direction, quietly steering outcomes, shaping responses, reinforcing the belief that discretion was survival. Cassian had learned to anticipate his father's expectations before they were spoken. That anticipation had made him successful, but had also made him cautious, sometimes to point of paralysis. Elowen saw how this caution spilled into their marriage. Cassian approached love the same way he approached leadership, with planning, prevention, and control. He believed shielding Elowen from risk was an act of devotion. He didn't see how that instinct conflicted with her need for autonomy. One afternoon, Elowen received an offer to consult on a major restoration project tied to a historical archive, one that required access to old corporate properties. She was excited, energized, in a way she hadn't felt in months. When she told Cassian, his reaction was immediate. Concern. Those records can be sensitive, he said carefully. You don't know who else might be watching. Elowen frowned. It's public history. Cassian nodded. Still, attention brings complications. That night, Elowen noticed how quickly Cassian had shifted from partner to gatekeeper. His tone wasn't harsh, but it was firm, final. Later, she realized the hesitation hadn't come from him alone. It had come from his father's voice echoing in his mind. Never give people access to what they can use against you. Cassian believed he was protecting Elowen from danger. What he didn't see was how fear, borrowed from another generation, was shaping his choices. Alaric, meanwhile, observed quietly. He noticed how Cassian spoke about Elowen with affection, but also concern. How he framed her independence as something to be managed rather than trusted. Alaric recognized the pattern because he had lived it. And for the first time, doubt crept into his certainty. He had raised a son who believed control equaled safety. Now he was watching that belief spill into a marriage. Still, Alaric said nothing. No, yet. Elowen, sensing the growing tension, tried to bridge the gap with understanding. She asked questions. She reassured. She softened her stance, not because she agreed, but because she loved Cassian and wanted peace. But peace built on silence is fragile. Cassian mistook her adaptability for agreement. He believed harmony meant alignment, not realizing it was being achieved through her restraint. And restraint, over time, becomes exhaustion. One evening, Elowen stood alone in their home, looking at shelves slowly filling with things chosen for her rather than by her. She realized how much her life had changed without a clear moment of decision. She hadn't been forced. She had been guided. The shadow of Alaric Holt stretched across generations, shaping not just businesses, but beliefs. Cassian stood within it, trying to love differently, but using the only tools he had been given. Elowen stood at the edge of that shadow, feeling its weight, without fully understanding its reach. Neither of them yet knew how far fear could go, or how destructive inherited lessons could become when left unchallenged. But the foundation had been set, and soon fear would no longer whisper. It would act. If this chapter made you think about how childhood, family, or upbringing shapes the way we love, please like this video so more people can hear this story. I want to know your thoughts. Do you think the way we're raised affects how we treat our partners as adults? Share your perspective in the comments. And if you enjoy love stories that reveal deep life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, because the next chapter shows how protection slowly turns into control. At first, Elowen couldn't pinpoint when things began to feel different. There was no argument, no sudden shift, no moment she could circle and say, that's when it started. Instead, it crept in quietly, disguised as care. Cassian began to speak more often about safety, about visibility, about how life had changed now that they were married, now that her name was attached to his in ways that reached beyond their home. It's not like before, he said one evening as they sat together in the living room, papers spread across the table. People watch more closely now. They ask questions. Elowen nodded slowly. She understood scrutiny. She understood responsibility. What she didn't yet understand was how easily caution could turn into confinement. Cassian suggested she let his team review her upcoming projects. Not to interfere, he assured her, but to anticipate risks. He asked her to avoid certain locations that drew media attention. He recommended postponing travel until schedules aligned better. Each request was delivered gently. Each one made sense on its own. That was the problem. Elowen found herself agreeing before fully thinking it through. It felt easier to adapt than to debate. Easier to reassure Cassian than to challenge him. His concern wasn't aggressive. It was persistent, woven into everyday conversation, like background noise. "You don't have to stop working," he told her. "Just be selective." Selective became limited. Limited became rare. She noticed it first when she declined a project she would have once accepted without hesitation. The work was meaningful. The location was safe. The timing was ideal. But Cassian hesitated. "I don't like the exposure," he said calmly. "It's unnecessary." Necessary. Elowen stared at the email confirmation after declining, an unexpected heaviness settling in her chest. She told herself it was temporary, that this that marriage required patience. Still, something felt off. Her days grew quieter, not peaceful, just smaller. Cassian noticed the change and misread it. He believed she needed reassurance, not autonomy. He responded with more structure, more planning, more involvement in decisions she once made alone. He began arranging her schedule alongside, not as a demand, but as efficiency. "It's easier when we coordinate," he said. And it was, but ease came at a cost. Elowen began to feel like a guest in her own life, navigating choices that had already been narrowed for her convenience. When she brought up her discomfort, Cassian listened, but responded with logic. "I'm not stopping you," he said. "I'm protecting us." Oh, that word carried weight. It made her hesitate, made her question whether asserting herself was selfish, made her wonder if independence and partnership could truly coexist at this level of life. Cassian believed he was doing what any responsible husband would do. He had been taught that leadership meant anticipating danger and eliminating it before it arrived. What he failed to see was that not all risks are threats. Some are necessary for growth. Elowen tried to articulate this once, choosing her words carefully. "I don't want to feel like I need permission to live my life," she said softly. Cassian frowned, not in anger, but confusion. "You don't," he replied. "I just want to be informed." But information slowly became approval. Approval slowly became expectation. And expectation quietly reshaped freedom. The intimacy between them remained warm, but something had shifted beneath it. Elowen felt herself becoming cautious, not around strangers, but around her husband. She measured her words, simplified her plans, avoided topics that led to resistance. Love, she realized, was beginning to feel like negotiation. Cassian, sensing the distance but misunderstanding its cause, leaned further into control, disguised as care. He believed clarity would fix what was wrong. He believed structure would restore peace. Instead, it tightened the walls. Neither of them spoke the truth aloud yet. Elowen didn't want to believe the man she loved could be limiting her. Cassian didn't want to believe love could exist without control. And in that silence, protection crossed an invisible line. Control didn't announce itself. It settled in quietly, one suggestion at a time, until freedom felt like something that needed justification. Elowen began to notice how often her instincts now paused before her actions, not because she doubted herself, but because she anticipated resistance. She would open her calendar, see an opportunity, feel a familiar spark of excitement, and then hear Cassian's voice in her mind before she heard her own. Is necessary? Is it safe? This the right time? Those questions used to come from outside her. Now they lived inside her. That realization unsettled her more than any argument ever could. One afternoon, Elowen received an invitation to consult on a restoration project connected to a historic archive, work that aligned perfectly with her expertise. The project involved reviewing old documents, stored within properties tied to several legacy corporations. It was meaningful, complex, and exactly the kind of challenge that once made her feel alive. She read the email twice. Then she hesitated. When she told Cassian, his reaction was measured but immediate. "I'm not comfortable with that," he said, setting his phone down slowly. "Those records can attract attention." Elowen folded her arms. "It's public history." Cassian nodded. Public doesn't mean harmless. Something inside her tightened. "I didn't ask if you were comfortable," she said quietly. "I told you because it's my work." The room went still. Cassian looked genuinely surprised, not angry, not defensive, just caught off guard. "I'm trying to keep you safe," he replied. "Why does that feel like an attack?" "Because safety shouldn't feel like permission," she wanted to say. But instead, she softened her tone. "I just don't want to feel limited." Cassian reached for her hand. "You're not limited. You're valued." Valued. The word sounded reassuring, but it didn't answer the question she hadn't fully asked yet. Valued by whom? And what cost? She agreed to postpone the project. Again, that night, Elowen lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling as his steady breathing filled the quiet. She tried to remember the woman she had been before. Decisive, curious, unafraid of uncertainty. She hadn't disappeared. She had adapted, and adaptation when done too often, becomes self-erasure. Cassian noticed the distance growing, but misunderstood its source. He believed Eloan needed more reassurance, more involvement, more clarity. He responded by tightening schedules, offering solutions before problems were voiced, making plans that assumed her agreement. He believed leadership meant eliminating doubt. Eloan began to feel like a problem that needed managing. She didn't confront him, not fully. She still loved him. She still believed intentions mattered. She still hoped awareness would arrive before damage did. But awareness requires listening. And Cassian was listening to fear more than to her. Small freedoms continued to slip away, not dramatically, but persistently. She stopped traveling alone. She reduced her professional circle. She avoided conversations that led to tension. She told herself she was choosing peace, but peace built on silence doesn't last. One evening, while sorting through old notes, Eloan came across a sketch she had made years ago, a rough drawing of a building she once dreamed of restoring. She remembered how excited she had been, how fearless she felt pursuing work simply because it mattered. She felt a pang of grief, not for what she had lost, but for what she had given away without noticing. Cassian walked in and noticed the sketch. "I forgot about project," he said gently. "So did I," Eloan replied. The words hung between them, heavier than she intended. Cassian studied her face. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Are you unhappy?" Eloan hesitated. This was the moment, the opening, the chance to speak fully. But fear, the same fear Cassian lived with, found its way into her, too. "I'm just tired," she said. Cassian nodded, relieved. "We'll slow things down. Slow things down." What she needed wasn't slowness. It was space. That night marked a quiet turning point, not because anything exploded, but because something inside Eloan shifted. She realized that love alone was not enough to sustain a relationship where freedom had to be negotiated. Cassian, meanwhile, believed everything was still under control. And that belief, unchecked, unquestioned, would soon lead him to a choice that crossed a line neither of them could return from. Because control, once normalized, doesn't stop at suggestions. It escalates, quietly, logically, until one day it justifies the unthinkable. The night began like any other. That was what made it so devastating. Eloan returned home just after dusk, her thoughts scattered between unfinished work and the quiet heaviness that had been following her for weeks. The house was calm. Lights dimmed to their usual warmth, the air carrying the familiar comfort of routine. Cassian was waiting for her. He stood near the window, jacket still on, his posture rigid in a way she immediately recognized. He turned when he heard her footsteps, his expression composed but distant, like someone rehearsing words he didn't want to say. "You're home late," he said. "Not later than usual," Eloan replied gently, setting her bag down. Silence followed. Cassian gestured toward the hallway. "Can we talk?" Her chest tightened, not from fear, but instinct. Something in his tone felt final. They walked together through the house, past rooms that held shared memories, quiet laughter, late-night conversations, moments of closeness that now felt strangely far away. Cassian stopped near the entrance to the east wing, an area rarely used, reserved mostly for guests. Elowen frowned. "Why here?" "For privacy," he said. That word again. Cassian took a breath. "There's something we'd to address." Elowen crossed her arms, steadying herself. "Then say it." He hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but strained beneath the surface. "For your safety, I need you to stay here for a while." Elowen blinked, confused. "Stay here?" "Just temporarily," he added quickly. "Until things settle." She laughed softly, certain she'd misunderstood. "Cassian, what are you talking about?" He reached for the door handle and turned it. The click echoed. Reality struck before panic did. "Cassian," she said slowly, disbelief sharpening her voice. "Open the door." He met her gaze through the narrowing gap, conflict flashing across his face. "Please trust me," he said quietly. "I'm doing this because I love you." The door closed and locked. Elowen stood frozen, staring at the wood as though it might move on its own. Her heart pounded, not with fear yet, but shock. Her mind raced, searching for logic, explanation, anything that made sense of what had just happened. She tried the handle. Locked. "Cassian?" Her voice trembled, despite her effort to stay calm. "This isn't okay." Footsteps retreated. Silence filled the room. The space was elegant, beautiful, in a way that now felt mocking. Soft lighting, carefully chosen furnishings, even fresh flowers. It was comfort arranged with intention. A cage disguised as care. Elowen paced, her breath shallow, thoughts colliding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a mistake. This was a choice. She knocked on the door, harder now. "Cassian, you don't get to decide this." No response. Minutes passed. Then hours. Elowen sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking as reality settled in. Memories replayed themselves. Every compromise, every postponed decision, every moment she had chosen peace over honesty. This was where it led. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, its sound magnified in the silence. 11:14 p.m. Her chest tightened as fear finally arrived. Not loud, not dramatic, but cold and steady. She stood again, pressing her forehead against the door, her voice breaking. "You promised me partnership." On the other side, Cassian stood, motionless. He could hear her, and still he stayed silent. That silence hurt more than the lock. Time dragged on, each second stretching unbearably. Elowen's thoughts spiraled, from confusion to anger to grief. Love had not ended in a fight or betrayal of affection. It had ended in control. As midnight approached, the house shifted. Footsteps echoed down the hallway. slower, heavier than Cassian's. A presence filled the space beyond the door, carrying authority and finality. A voice cut through the silence. "This ends tonight." Elowen's breath caught. She recognized that voice. Alaric Holt. Keys rattled. The lock began to turn. And Elowen realized that whatever truth waited on the other side of that door would change everything she thought she knew about love, power, and the man she had married. The lock turned slowly, deliberately, each metallic click echoing through Elowen's chest. The door opened. Alaric Holt stepped inside first. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. His presence filled the room with a weight Elowen had never felt so directly before. His eyes moved across the space, the flowers, the soft lighting, the carefully arranged comfort, and something dark passed through his expression. Then Cassian entered behind him. He looked smaller now, not physically, but emotionally. Elowen stood frozen between them, her heart racing, her mind struggling to keep pace with reality. She felt exposed, not because of the room, but because the truth was finally pressing its way to the surface. "What is this?" she asked, her voice steady only by force of will. Alaric's gaze softened, not to kindness, but into honesty. "This is where silence ends." Cassian swallowed hard. "Father." "Enough," Alaric said sharply. "You've already said too much by saying nothing at all." Lowen's eyes flicked to Cassian. "You locked me in here," she said quietly. "Why?" Cassian stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "I was trying to buy time." "Time for what?" she asked. "For things to disappear," Alaric answered. "For him. For questions to stop being asked." Lowen's breath caught. Alaric turned to her fully. Years ago, decisions were made within this family that were never meant to see daylight. Records were adjusted, properties reassigned. Everything legal on the surface, just enough to pass scrutiny. Elowen's mind raced back to the waterfront estate. The irregular ledgers, the documents tucked behind walls, the things she had noticed, but never questioned deeply. "You found parts of it," Alaric said. "Not intentionally, but thoroughly." Cassian's voice cracked. "I didn't know when we met, I swear. But you knew later," Elowen said. He nodded, shame flooding his face. "I panicked. You married me," she said, "and you locked me away. I thought love would be enough," he whispered. "I thought if I protected you, protected us, it would all go away." Elowen felt something inside her fracture, not with rage, but with grief. "Protection doesn't look like this," she said softly. Alaric watched his son carefully. "I raised you to believe control was strength," he said. "Tonight, I see the cost of that lesson." Silence fell again, this time heavy with truth. "What happens now?" Lowen asked. Alaric straightened out. By morning, everything will be addressed properly. The truth will no longer be hidden. She nodded slowly. And my marriage? Cassian's eyes filled with hope. Eloan, please. She held up a hand. You made a choice tonight, she said, and so will I. Eloan walked to the bed and picked up a small bag she hadn't realized she'd packed earlier in panic. Her movements were calm now, purposeful. Cassian reached for her hand, stopping just short. I love you. She met his gaze, her eyes steady. Love doesn't cage. She stepped past him and into the hallway. The mansion felt different, emptier, stripped of illusion. Each step carried both pain and relief. She didn't look back. At the door, Alaric spoke quietly. You deserved better. Eloan nodded once. So did he. But fear taught him otherwise. Outside, the night air was cool, sharp, with clarity. Midnight had passed, but dawn was on its way. As Eloan walked away from the estate, she felt something unfamiliar but powerful settle within her. Freedom. She didn't know what the future held. She only knew what she was no longer willing to accept. That knowledge was enough. Midnight did not arrive with noise. It came quietly, settling over the estate like a final verdict. Eloan stood in the hallway just beyond the room she had been locked inside, her heart still racing, her mind struggling to absorb the weight of everything that had just been revealed. The truth didn't explode. It pressed in slowly, reshaping everything she thought she understood about her marriage. Alaric Holt remained near the doorway, his posture rigid, but his expression changed. The man who had built an empire through control and foresight now looked burdened by something heavier than consequence. Regret. Cassian stood several steps behind them, his head bowed, hands clenched, the image of composure stripped away. For the first time since Eloan had known him, he looked unsure of where to stand. The power dynamic had shifted. Eloan broke the silence. How long? She asked. Cassian looked up. Longer than I want to admit. She nodded, absorbing the answer. And you thought locking me away would fix it? I thought I could contain it, he said quietly. I thought I could protect you from what I'd done. Eloan met his gaze. You didn't protect me. You protected your fear. Alaric exhaled slowly. Fear has guided this family for too long, he said. It's tonight. He explained what would happen next, not as a threat, but as a course correction. Lawyers would be contacted, records reviewed, the truth addressed before it festered further. Cassian listened in silence. For once, there was nothing to manage, nothing to control, only accountability. Eloan felt strangely calm as the plan unfolded, not because the pain was gone, but because uncertainty had been replaced by clarity. The cage had been built from secrets. Now those secrets were exposed. I'm leaving, she said simply. Cassian's breath hitched. Please don't go like this. There's no other way, she replied. Not Tonight, she gathered what little she needed. The act felt symbolic, choosing only what mattered, leaving behind everything built on illusion. As she moved through the house, memories surfaced uninvited. Laughter in the kitchen, late-night conversations, quiet moments of intimacy that had once felt safe. They weren't lies, but they weren't enough. Cassian followed her to the entrance, desperation replacing control. "I can change," he said. "I see it now." Elowen paused, her hand resting on the door. "Change isn't something you promise when you're cornered," she said. "It's something you prove when you're free." She stepped outside. The night air wrapped around her, cool and grounding. She inhaled deeply, feeling the tension in her chest ease just slightly. The estate loomed behind her, silent now, not powerful, not frightening, just still. Inside, Cassian watched her leave, the weight of his choices pressing down with painful clarity. For the first time, he understood that love could not survive control, no matter how carefully it was disguised. Alaric stood beside him, his voice low. "You tried to protect everything, and nearly lost the only thing that mattered." Cassian nodded, tears slipping free. "I don't know how to fix this." Alaric placed a hand on his shoulder. "You start by telling the truth to everyone, especially yourself." Elowen walked toward the waiting night, her future uncertain but no longer confined. Midnight had revealed the truth, and in doing so, had shattered everything built on fear. But sometimes, what shatters also clears the way. Elowen didn't look back as she walked away from the estate. She expected tears, panic, or regret, but what she felt instead was a strange stillness. Not peace yet, but clarity, the kind that arrives when a difficult truth finally settles into place. The night stretched ahead of her, open and uncertain. For the first time in months, that uncertainty didn't frighten her. She stayed with a close friend that night, someone who didn't ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. The quiet felt different there, uncomplicated, unmeasured. Elowen slept deeply for the first time in weeks. Morning arrived softly. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, warming the room, reminding her that time continued even after everything had shifted. She sat up slowly, letting the events of the night replay themselves without resistance. The locked door, the revelation, the choice. None of it had been imagined. As the day unfolded, Elowen made deliberate decisions. She contacted her firm, reaffirmed her availability, and accepted the project she had postponed for so long. Her voice felt steady as she spoke, grounded by resolve rather than anger. She wasn't reclaiming her life dramatically. She was reclaiming it thoughtfully. Meanwhile, across the city, Cassian faced a morning unlike any other. The empire he had helped build felt suddenly fragile, not because of external threats, but because truth had entered the equation. Lawyers arrived early. Documents were reviewed. Decisions were questioned. For the first time, Cassian wasn't managing outcomes. He was confronting consequences. Alaric oversaw the process with a different posture than before, less commanding, more deliberate. He didn't shield his son from accountability. He didn't soften the reality. This is how repair begins, he said simply. Cassian listened. He thought about Eloan, about her calm strength, her honesty, her unwillingness to accept love that demanded silence. He realized how deeply he had mistaken control for care. That realization hurt more than any legal consequence. Days passed. Eloan settled into a rhythm shaped by intention rather than adaptation. She returned to work fully, immersing herself in projects that challenged and fulfilled her. She spent evenings reflecting, not avoiding. Healing didn't rush her. It unfolded gradually. She didn't erase Cassian from her life. She placed him where he belonged, in her past, not her present. Cassian reached out once, carefully, without expectation. Eloan listened, but she didn't soften her boundaries. I hope you find peace, she told him, but I won't trade mine. He understood. Alaric, in a rare moment of vulnerability, contacted Eloan as well. Not to persuade, not to explain, simply to acknowledge. You showed us what truth looks like, he said, even when it costs. Eloan thanked him, but didn't carry his burden. The truth had shattered everything, but it had also revealed something essential. Freedom isn't the absence of love. It's the presence of choice. Eloan didn't know what the future held, whether love would find her again, or what form it might take. What she did know was that she would never again mistake control for devotion. Midnight had passed. The truth had spoken, and in its wake, something stronger than fear had begun to grow. Walking away didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers. For Eloan, the first layer was physical distance. She moved out quietly, choosing a temporary place that felt neutral, neither an escape nor a retreat. The space was modest, uncluttered, filled with light. It reminded her of who she had been before everything became complicated. She unpacked slowly, deliberately. Each item placed where she chose felt like a small act of reclamation. The second layer was emotional. That part took longer. Grief arrived unexpectedly, not for the marriage itself, but for the version of love she had believed in. She mourned the future she had imagined, the shared routines, the quiet intimacy that had once felt genuine. Some nights, she missed Cassian terribly. Not the man who locked a door, but the man who once listened. The man who remembered details. The man who spoke about trust as if it were sacred. She allowed herself to feel that loss without guilt. Healing, she learned, didn't require erasing love. It required understanding it. Eloan returned to her work fully, throwing herself into projects that demanded focus and creativity. Restoring old spaces felt symbolic now, strengthening foundations, exposing hidden flaws, choosing honesty over appearance. Each completed project reinforced a truth she was still learning to live by. Things don't fall apart because they're weak. They fall apart because cracks are ignored. Cassian's days unfolded very differently. Without Eloin's quiet presence grounding him, the house felt vast and hollow. The routines that once felt controlled now felt empty. For the first time, silence didn't offer peace. It demanded reflection. He attended meetings where questions were no longer deflected. He listened as advisors discussed accountability, transparency, and repair. The empire continued, but it moved differently now. Slower, more exposed. Cassian felt the weight of his decisions constantly. He replayed the night of the locked door over and over, wishing he could undo it. Wishing he had listened earlier. Wishing he had chosen trust when it still mattered. He reached out to Eloin once, not to plead, not to argue, but to acknowledge. "I'm sorry," he said, simply, "not for what I lost, but for what I did." Eloin listened quietly. "I believe you," she replied. "But belief doesn't rebuild trust." Cassian accepted that. It was the hardest lesson he had ever learned. Alaric watched his son carefully during this time. He saw the unraveling, not of power, but of certainty. For the first time, Cassian was not acting from fear or control. He was listening. "You don't fix this by reclaiming authority," Alaric told him one evening. "You fix it by relinquishing it." Cassian nodded, understanding finally dawning. Eloin, meanwhile, began to notice a change within herself. She no longer hesitated before making decisions. She no longer anticipated resistance. Her instincts returned, not cautiously, but confidently. Walking away had been painful, but staying would have been destructive. She didn't frame her choice as failure. She framed it as growth, because sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is leave, not because love didn't exist, but because it wasn't healthy enough to stay. Time did what it always does. It softened the sharpest edges, but it never erased the truth. For Eloin, healing came in quiet milestones. The first time, she accepted a project without explaining herself to anyone. The first morning, she woke up excited instead of cautious. The first evening, she laughed freely, without wondering if her joy would make someone else uneasy. She began to recognize herself again, not the woman she had been before marriage, but someone stronger, more aware, someone who understood that love should expand your world, not narrow it. She redecorated her new space slowly, choosing colors and textures that felt grounding. She surrounded herself with reminders of why she loved her work: old sketches, restored photographs, notes from clients who valued her honesty. These weren't distractions. They were affirmations. Cassian, on the other hand, faced the long work of unlearning. Without Eloin's quiet adaptability smoothing his edges, he was forced to confront how much he had relied on control to feel safe. Meetings became uncomfortable. Silence became revealing. He noticed how often he wanted to manage outcomes instead of listening. He resisted that instinct, sometimes poorly, sometimes successfully, but always consciously. Alaric stepped back from daily operations, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement. The empire no longer needed a single shadow guiding it. It needed transparency. You can't lead people you don't trust, Alaric told Cassian, and you can't trust people you try to control. Those words lingered. Cassian sought counsel, not from advisors, but from people who weren't impressed by power. People who spoke plainly, who challenged him without fear. It was uncomfortable. It was necessary. He learned to sit with uncertainty instead of eliminating it, to ask questions without steering the answers, to hear criticism without correcting it. And slowly, something shifted. Not redemption, understanding. Eloan and Cassian crossed paths once. Months later, at a professional gathering neither had expected to attend. The moment was brief, polite, restrained, honest. They spoke without bitterness. "I hope you're well," Cassian said. "I am," Eloan replied. And she meant it. They didn't discuss the past. They didn't reopen wounds. They simply acknowledged each other as people who had shared something meaningful and learned something costly. As Eloan walked away that evening, she felt no pull backward, only gratitude for the lesson. Walking away had not made her smaller. It had made her clearer. Cassian watched her go, understanding finally that love doesn't entitle you to someone's freedom. That devotion is proven not by how tightly you hold, but by how willingly you let go. Both of them were changed, not broken, changed. And change, when accepted honestly, becomes growth. Eloan didn't rebuild her life all at once. She rebuilt it the same way she restored old spaces, carefully, intentionally, and with respect for what had been damaged. Her days settled into a rhythm that felt authentic again. Mornings were quiet and purposeful. She returned to projects that challenged her intellect and nourished her sense of meaning. Each decision, small or large, belonged to her. That mattered more than she had expected. She learned to trust her instincts again, to move forward without seeking reassurance, to say yes because she wanted to, and no because she didn't owe explanations for her boundaries. Freedom, she realized, wasn't reckless. It was grounded. Eloan also learned to sit with discomfort. Healing wasn't linear. Some days carried unexpected waves of sadness, moments when memories resurfaced without warning. She allowed those moments space, recognizing them not as setbacks, but as reminders of how deeply she had loved. Love had been real, but so had the cost. She didn't rush into new relationships, not out of fear, but out of respect for herself. She wanted her next chapter, whatever it looked like, to be written from wholeness rather than recovery. Meanwhile, Cassian's world continued its slow transformation. The empire endured, but it no longer moved in secrecy. Transparency became policy, not performance. Cassian stepped away from daily leadership, choosing to learn rather than command. For the first time, he allowed others to see uncertainty without disguising it as control. It humbled him. He began speaking openly about accountability, not as confession, but as commitment. He stopped positioning himself as protector and started positioning himself as partner in business, in family, and in his own growth. Alaric watched this evolution with quiet introspection. In stepping back, he faced the legacy he had created, not just in wealth, but in belief. For the first time, he questioned the idea that control was the highest form of strength. He saw now what fear had cost his son, and what honesty had restored. Eloan, hearing from a distance about the changes within the Holt Empire, felt no sense of validation, only closure. She didn't need proof that leaving had been right. She already knew. One afternoon, while reviewing an old structure in need of careful repair, Eloan paused and smiled at a familiar truth. Rebuilding wasn't about returning to what once was. It was about choosing what came next. She felt open, not guarded, hopeful, not naive, grounded, not confined. She had learned something essential. Love should never ask you to disappear. Growth should never require silence. And freedom, once reclaimed, becomes the foundation for everything else. Time did not rush Eloan toward a new beginning. It waited, and when she was ready, life met her gently. Months passed, marked not by dramatic milestones, but by quiet confidence. Eloan no longer measured her worth by how well she fit into someone else's world. She measured it by how fully she lived in her own. Her work flourished. She was invited to lead projects that required not just technical skill, but judgment and integrity. Younger consultants sought her guidance, drawn not to her past, but to her clarity. She taught them something she had learned the hard way, that details matter, yes, but boundaries matter more. In her personal life, Eloan learned to enjoy connection without surrender. She formed friendships rooted in mutual respect. Conversations felt easy again. Laughter came without restraint. When love eventually found her again, it arrived without urgency. It was different this time. There were no promises of protection, no need to manage outcomes, just curiosity, presence, and space. She noticed how this new connection didn't require her to shrink or explain herself. It felt steady, not consuming, supportive, not directive. And for the first time, she understood what partnership truly meant. Elsewhere, Cassian continued the work of becoming someone he had never been taught how to be. He no longer chased control. He practiced trust, awkwardly at first, then with intention. He learned that leadership didn't mean shielding others from risk, but empowering them to face it honestly. His relationship with his father changed too. Alaric, older now, in ways that had nothing to do with age, began speaking differently. Less certain, more reflective. He acknowledged mistakes without defensiveness. He listened. "I thought strength meant never yielding," he admitted once. "I was wrong." Cassian didn't argue. He had learned that some truths didn't need debate. Eloan and Cassian never returned to what they had been, and that was the point. Their story didn't end in reunion, but in resolution, in mutual recognition of growth that came too late for one relationship, but just in time for themselves. Years later, when Eloan stood inside a restored building once thought beyond saving, she felt a familiar sense of fulfillment. Light poured through windows that had been sealed for decades. Strong foundations supported something new, without erasing what had come before. She smiled, recognizing the metaphor without needing to explain it. Life had taught her well. Love is not proven by sacrifice alone. Care is not measured by control. And the strongest relationships are built where freedom and trust stand side by side. Eloan had lost a marriage, but she had gained herself, and that, she knew now, was not a tragedy. It was the beginning. If this story moved you, please like this video so it can reach someone who needs this message today. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What lesson from Eloan's journey stayed with you the most? And if you believe love stories should uplift, heal, and teach real-life lessons, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more powerful stories like this.